Hi, everyone. I am Charlotte, and welcome back to the Story Coaching Podcast. So, today we are going to be talking about writing the messy middle. And the messy middle is a phrase that, one of my good writing friends and we came up with years ago when we were talking about how difficult the middle of a book can be to write. And I think a lot of people experience this. The beginning is naturally exciting. The beginning is where you're meeting your character, you're getting introduced to the world, if that's something that's different. You're and you have the inciting incident. You have that big excitement where suddenly the hero is going to go on their adventure, and the end of the book is pretty naturally exciting too. That's where we've got the climax. That's where we've got the big finale. That's where everything is happening. But the middle, the middle always seems like a bit of a desert. It always seems like there's not much happening there. And yet, we know that the middle can make or break a book. It is, I think, actually the most important part. And the good news is that once you understand the middle and what its purpose is, it becomes a lot easier to write. Maybe easier and harder, depending on how you think about things. But so let's talk about what happens with that middle. And what I see a lot of the time is I see people giving up when they're in the middle. And that's why I think it messy is a good word for it, because it can feel kind of gross sometimes. And I have seen more people than I want to talk about give up. And it's like they can't think of what the next thing to happen should be. And they start to believe that because they can't see what the next thing should be, they start to think that the story is broken. And either they think the story is broken or that they themselves are broken, that they themselves are just not good writers because they've gotten kind of bogged down in this middle section. And why I think the middle is so difficult is because we, as writers, always want a book to feel like reading. We want the story to be obvious. We want things to just naturally sort of come together, naturally sort of fall together, and for things to really just click, and each next step really just to be the obvious next step. And what's really happening there, where I think people get confused, especially in the middle, especially trying to make the story obvious, is that we tend to focus on the external events of a story. We as writers tend to do this in the story. We as readers, when we're telling someone about a story, we tend to focus on the external events. And heck, I mean, even as regular human beings leading our everyday lives, we always tend to focus on the external. We never think about what's actually important, what actually makes the middle exciting, which is the internal story. So some of the main things I want you to take away from this episode, and the first one is what we've been talking about, in episodes 1 through 4. It's that stories are a discovery process. We want things to be obvious. We want it to be effortless. But to make a story look effortless, a lot of effort is actually involved. And so when we're stuck in the messy middle, it's not abnormal to be stuck. It's not unusual to be stuck in the middle, because that's when things actually do tend to get complicated. That's when it is a bit of a nebula. It's a bit of just it's a cloud of a bunch of different things happening, and it's hard to follow a story through that sometimes. But if you're excited about the story, if this is a story that you want to write, it's important not to give up at this point. Because sort of getting stuck here is a very natural process, or a very natural thing. And we know that there's a discovery process. We know that there are ways to get through it. It's just putting in that time and effort and that willingness to try. Right? And so just like writing, just like becoming an author, it's a journey again to discover the story, to discover, really the soul, the inner workings, what of a story, what it is that really makes a story special. It's a process to discover that. And and the good news is, everything is writable, and every human can learn to do it. Every writer is an author that can figure this out. And most importantly, the messy middle is all about internal shifts. And books, really, we think about them in terms of external events, but they're really internal. They're internal journeys. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later in this episode, what that really means and what that looks like. But let's just talk about the process of writing again. Writing is the opposite of reading. They're not the same. they're not just a one extension of another. They are opposites. And so if you can imagine a book, and if you can imagine the process to writing a book, so if we think first draft, second draft, third through 10th draft, and and then editing and proof copy, and then final copy. We can think about, picture like 5 steps, right? From first draft to final copy. As a reader, you see that process from one side. You see it from the side that is looking directly at the finished product. You're aware maybe that the other steps exist, but you're seeing the finished product. You're seeing that book. And the difference between a reader and a writer is how they see that book. So the reader is standing on the side of the finished book. And when they look at the finished book, that's really all they see. But the writer is standing on the other side. And the writer sees the first draft and the second draft and the editing, and they see all of the steps between, all the way from idea to finished book. And so the way that we see stories, the way that we experience a book becomes very different when we're a writer than when we're a reader. And it's all about perspective. We forget that, especially as beginning writers. We think, I love reading, and I know how that works. Obviously, writing is just the opposite of, or writing is just the opposite of that. And writing is going to be just like reading, but from the other direction. And that's true, but that's that misses the whole point of writing. Writing is not about the finished book. It's about all of the in-between. So when you read something that flows easily and it's endlessly exciting, and everything just sort of clicks together in that middle portion, it's taken probably months to get that book that way. So the thing that you need to ask yourself when you're kind of stuck in this messy middle section is, if you knew your book could be as good as, your favorite book, whatever that is, how much time would you spend on it? How willing would you be to massage it and turn it into that finished product? And I hope it's a lot, because that is kind of what it takes sometimes. But the good news is that story structure and what we're going to talk about in a minute here with that messy middle and how to look at that differently, the story structure can be learned, and I know we've talked about this over and over again, but you don't have to know how to do it all up front. But it does take time to learn the story structure. And it really takes time to learn each story's unique features. What it is that makes each story special. Their their soul, the soul of a story. And this is something that took me a long time to recognize, because it seems like, for me, it seemed like, yes, of course, the first book is going to be a learning process. And so I wrote the first book and the second book and the third book. They were all in a series together, and it was just a big learning process. But as I learned, I thought, great, now I know how to do it. Now I know how to write the setup and the exciting incident. Now I even know how to write the middle section. I know how to write the climax. I know how to write the end. I thought, great, I know how to do it, and all I need to do to write my next book is just do that all over again. But here's the thing. Each story is different. And that's the wonderful thing about writing too, is that each story is different. Each story has its uniqueness. But when you're writing a story, you need to be prepared that it's going to take time to learn each individual story's unique features. Right? So I thought, hey, it took me, it ended up being like 2 years to write, these first 3 books. And that was after 10 years of sort of dreaming about it and thinking about it. So it took me 2 years to write these first 3 books. And I thought I had it nailed. Right? I thought I knew what I was doing. And I sat down to write the next book. And I did what a lot of writers do, where I started strong, and I got stuck. And I started to think, this story is broken. This story is broken. And then I started to think, it happened a couple of times, and I started to think, I'm a bit broken. Maybe those other books, they were kind of a one-off. And what it's actually taken me a really long time, I shouldn't say a really long time, but what I've been on this journey to discover is that you can learn story structure. You can learn how all of the pieces are supposed to line up. But what you need to be able to do is look deeper at the individual story and all of the unique individual features of that story. And that's a process too that you can figure out, but it is a process that needs to be done with each and every book that you write. And I'll just remind you again that, so many of the popular books that are out there actually took years to write. And that's because it was a discovery process. And particularly focusing on this messy middle, because external events, they're easy. They're the easy part of the story. And we'll talk in a second about what that really means, but the inner story, the important part of the story, that's tricky. And that's what needs to be paid special attention to with each and every book that you write. And the question, if you're feeling stuck, the real question that you need to learn to ask yourself is, what is it that I don't know about this story? What is it that I still have to learn? And we go back to story planning and story discovery techniques, asking why and how to get deeper and deeper into the story. And that usually will lead you out of the middle. Once we discover more about the story, we can suddenly start to see the path forward. But a lot of people, because we think in terms of the external world, we don't really think in terms of the internal world. A lot of people get stuck at the external level, and they're not willing to ask the questions and to go deep. Right? So just a reminder, everything is writable, and every writer is an author. There's no story idea that's broken. There's no writer that's broken. It just takes work, and it just takes time to discover a story's secrets and get it to come together in that specific and obvious way. And I believe that every story does fit together, right? So even if you've got what feels like the most broken, haphazard barely patched together sinking submarine of a story, there is a way that all of those pieces will connect. But sometimes it can take time to find it. And so while that's meant to be, sort of a bit of a warning, it's also a bit of inspiration that there is always a way for a story to come together. And there is always a way. There is always a way. Everything is writable. That's the premise that I have lived my life by for my writing life by since I started. Every idea can be figured out, and every idea will fit together in a specific and obvious way. But it can take time. And so let's talk now more specifically about what happens in the middle. What is it really that makes a good book good? What is it about those good books and what's happening in their middle sections that lets them stand out, that sets them apart from, the books where the middle section is not so good, and those books that, you get halfway through and you put down, right? So what makes a great middle section? And the middle section is really all about internal growth. I see a lot of books. I see a lot of published books. I see a lot of writers that seem to believe that the middle is really just about these escalating steps of tension and this escalating sort of external events. So it's kind of like, the every car chase movie in the history of car chase movies, where it's like, oh, little car crash, bigger car crash, bigger car crash, even bigger car crash, and then the biggest car crash you can imagine. It's just like escalating these external events over and over and over again. And the problem there, and I think that might have worked 20, 50 years ago, when stories were, stories being told to the general population as books or as movies or TV, where we could be excited by those things, but now they seem, readers tend to burn out. We tend to get, we tend to just get a little bit blasé about, worsening and worsening external events. Like I remember when like the first like CSI crime shows came out, and they were showing little blood spatters, and that was shocking. But now we see on TV, we see, people with their heads cut off and gutted and all of these gross and disgusting things, and we're kind of blasé about it. We've sort of been, what's the right word? We've just been immunized against it. We've been sort of desensitized to things in the external world, and so if you just keep escalating your external events, if you've just got bigger and bigger car crashes happening, the readers lose interest. They don't care. They become desensitized to it. Where we get to really hold on to the interest of readers is when we look at that internal story again. And so the internal story is all about a character's values. It's about their internal conflict and their personal tension of putting, warring wants and needs against each other. That's where the story is. And the thing with having warring wants and needs, and this goes back to action cycles, which we talked about in, I think, episode 3. So this goes back to action cycles. We also talk about this in the Pick Up the Pen challenge, kind of at length. And, an action cycle is all about something happening, and then what the consequences of that inciting incident could be, the complicating factors, and then the crisis where we start looking at the two or more opposing values that are challenged, and we need to decide which of our values we're going to honor and which of them we're going to essentially turn our backs against in order to make a decision and make an action. So I think the example I gave was do I leave the house to go to the grocery store to get butter or eggs for making cookies, or do I stay inside where it's warm and I can be in my comfy pants, right? So these two values, do I make my kids happy, do I make myself happy? And the tension, and what really makes the middle section interesting, is looking at these two values, two or more. You can have more values come in at one time. We're looking at these values, we're pitting these values against each other, and we're asking the character to choose which value is more important to them, and the character will choose, and the character, as a result of that choice, will take some action, and we drive the story forward, and we keep putting the character through increasingly complicated value challenges, and getting them to really get to the core of who they are. And eventually they're going to have an internal belief change. They're going to go from thinking, oh, the most important thing in the world is to be comfortable myself and to sit in my warm house in my comfy pants. They're going to shift to saying, hey, every time I'm going to choose my kids, right? That's such a silly example, but at its core, I mean, it's doing the same thing. And readers like this story because readers are humans, and we humans, we go through this same cycle as we try to make decisions about what we're going to do each and every day, and we experience internal growth or personal growth, and we are interested in seeing how other people tackle challenges like this. And so that's what's happening about the middle section. And so, as an example, and an example I pull out oftentimes is the Hunger Games. Book one of the Hunger Games, the main character, Katniss, ends up being selected, or she ends up in the in essentially a death arena where lots of children called tributes are there, and they're going to kill each other until there's only one person left. So I mean, on the outside already, it sounds like a pretty exciting story, and the whole middle section of that book, it's not like it's all of the external stuff. I mean, there's stuff happening, yes, but it's not like, Katniss, the main character, she ends up, first she ends up in the arena, and then she has like a little scuffle with somebody, and then, she goes and hides, and then someone comes after her, and then, it's not like she's being attacked and her life is being threatened, and she's being attacked and her life is being threatened, and she's being attacked and her life is being threatened. That happens in the beginning. That sets the external tension of the story. That sets the like life and death outside story. But what the middle section is really about, and what Suzanne Collins did so beautifully in that middle section, was take Katniss through an internal value shift, where Katniss starts out believing, I need to be the only one that survives. I need to be by myself. I need to be strong. I need to be the top dog here. And I need to figure out how to win. I need to figure out how to be the last person standing. That's where she starts. And by the end of that middle section, she has shifted. And she's shifted to, I need to get myself and my friend Peta out of here. It's no longer about being the last person. It's no longer about winning. I mean, it's sort of about winning because that's how she's going to get out of there. But her entire value her value outlook has changed, so that the only thing she cares about is getting the two of them out. Not the one, but the two. And she starts to embrace this idea of friendship and partnership. And at the end, she even goes so far as to, she is willing to lose her own life in order to get the two of them out. She says it's the two of us or it's no one. There's no longer an option for her to be the one because of the internal shifts that she has gone through. And that is, I mean, it's just beautifully well done. And I mean, obviously that's another one that's been a bestseller and has, hit the movie theaters and all of those things. But what sets it apart so much, I think, really is how that internal shift, how that middle section is managed. And so that, if you haven't had a chance to read it, I mean, it's such a fantastic, I mean, it's a fun story to begin with, but it's such a fantastic example of how little events are happening to create this big overall shift. And it's really a shift internally. And it's because of the internal change that she's actually able to be victorious in the end, right? And that's really what the middle section is about. It's about changing the character's internal life, how they think, what they value. It's changing that so that they have what it takes to step up and be the hero and win against whatever challenge they are facing, right? The middle section changes them so that they're able to succeed. That's the whole point of the middle section. And so when you're sitting down to write your middle section, recognize that it's not about external events. It is about internal events. And what you really need to do and what you really need to look at is, what is the shift that my main character is going to make in order to succeed? What's the shift? What has to change? And once you know how their thinking has to change, then you start to piece together, well, what are some smaller versions of this that can test their belief system and push them towards this change? And that's really the whole middle section. And that is the most important part of a book. That's the biggest part of a book. And that's something that is really starting to, I think, just be so important in fiction today, is to have that internal shift. And when we think about the middle section, if you want to picture just a simple diagram of, I'm going to say like a sinusoidal curve, but if we picture the external tension, it's going to start up nice and high. That's the inciting instant. That's the beginning of the story. But that external tension, the external events, excitement is actually going to drop. It's going to drop right down in the middle. And what's going to happen is the internal tension, it's going to start out pretty low, because the focus is more on the external stuff, getting to know the character in the world and what their kind of goals in their everyday sort of conflicts are. But the internal tension is going to start pretty low, but it's going to start to rise. And in that middle section, the internal tension becomes so much more important. And that's because the character's values are being challenged. So the middle section, we're challenging those values. And the external tension, things are still happening, yeah, sure, but it doesn't matter so much what the external things are. The external things are there to support the internal story. And then as we come to the conclusion, they do flip back so that climax is, about, the climax is actually about both kind of coming together, but the right at the end, I mean, the external tension comes back up, and the internal tension, that value shift, has actually usually been resolved. So that's how you write the middle. And if you're looking for more help in figuring out, okay, what's the value shift I have to take my character through, because that's not something that we're ever really taught to think about. But that's something that, I mean, that's the core of what I teach in the Right Now program that I run a couple times a year. But you can also download the story planning guide, which takes you through kind of the beginnings of that process of how to figure that out. And you can get that, again, free download. You put your email address in and it sends off to you, thewritable.com/story planning guide. And you can find that easily. You can also find that just by going through the free resources section on the website. So that is everything for today. So I know that's just a pretty broad overview, but that is, I mean, that's the core. If you only could know one thing about the middle section, if I could only teach you one thing about the middle section, it's all about the internal story, and the rest you'd be able to figure out from there. I mean, that's the core of it. That's the root. That's the most important piece. And the middle, again, I really think is the most important piece to any book, period. It's not the premise, it's not the idea behind the story. Remember, idea doesn't matter, it's just execution. It's not about, the big climax, it's not about the big finale, it's about everything in between that makes the rest of that know something or mean something. And that is what the human brain craves. That's what the reader brain craves. That story listening brain just latches onto is the meaning and the emotion, and that all comes right out of the middle section. So take that as you will. Maybe chew on it for a little while, because that is not something that really gets talked about very much at all. And but again, I mean, really should be. And that's why we're here, because we're talking about these types of things. So thank you again for listening, and I will see you next week on our next podcast episode. And until then, happy writing, happy middle build, happy internal character shifts. Thanks, guys.